Pepsi Prebiotic Cola in original and cherry vanilla. That Pepsi taste you love with no artificial sweeteners and 3 grams of prebiotic fiber. Pepsi Prebiotic Cola. Unbelievably Pepsi.
Experience a membership that backs what you're building with American Express Business Platinum. Get 2 times membership rewards points per dollar on eligible purchases in key business categories, as well as on each eligible purchase of $5,000 or more, on up to $2 million in eligible purchases per calendar year. American Express Business Platinum. There's nothing like it. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum.
We gather here tonight to bring women back to their rightful place.
The Testaments, a new Hulu original series from the executive producers of The Handmaid's Tale.
It's easier to accept a story than believe that the people around you are monsters.
The battle isn't over.
There comes a time when you have to take action, when you have to choose your own destiny.
Never quite as it seems.
Watch the new Hulu original series, The Testaments, streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
Hello and welcome back to the Dunbar End podcast here on the Hibs Observer YouTube channel. I am Jack Harris. As ever, I'm joined by Hibs Observer editor Patrick McPartlin. A lot to discuss. We're not going to flog the dead horse of the Aberdeen game too much, but we will, Patrick, talk about Miguel Chaiwa. There's been some interest. David Gray was talking about that in the press conference. What are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting one for me because I think when he arrived in the summer, he looked like a really interesting kind of signing. Bit of excitement there. I mean, a good age. I think he was 21 when he came in, and obviously playing for a sort of top flight team in Switzerland. Young boys as well, no slouches. In terms of that Champions League experience and just the kind of ceiling that he's got, and I think it maybe was overshadowed a little bit because he arrived sort of roughly around the same time as Thibaut Clichy came in from the same division for record transfer fee, and I think he's maybe been a bit unlucky not to play more matches. And I think when you look back at the start of the season, the Hibs had quite a settled midfield kind of combination. You didn't really want to change it unless you absolutely had to. And I think there's been some games that he's been really impressive and other games where it's been clear that he still has a lot of development to go through, still a lot to work on. And I think it's one of those things that Hibs are becoming very good at as a club is sourcing these players from elsewhere, bringing them in, progressing them, developing them, and then because they are a selling club, ideally selling them on for a price which is several times what they paid for him in the first place. Kieran Bowie is a good example, going back a few years, Josh Doig. And I think, Chaiwa is somebody who probably has quite a high ceiling when you consider, he's an international regular for Zambia. You can see in some of the games he's played, I think back to Legia Warsaw when he scored that solo goal, we've seen elements of it in the Scottish Premiership matches.
Yeah, it was that one against. Is it just the goal against St Mirren he's got in the league?
Yes.
Yeah, that sort of third goal in Paisley.
And you can see that there is a player in there. You can also see that there is still a lot of development to come. So I think it's not surprising there's been the interest. I think he does have that high ceiling, and the stats that he's sort of putting in on a weekly basis, which is part of the reason why Hibs wanted to bring him in, just it's sort of points towards that as well, and that there is going to be interest. I think if he was to leave this summer, it would have to be for probably a sort of silly price, one that Hibs couldn't turn down, because he does strike me as the kind of player who would really probably benefit from another kind of half season to full season at Hibs, just developing, settling into the Scottish Premiership, and I suppose trying to hold down a starting role on a weekly basis and not just sort of coming in as a result of injuries. And I think that if you're comparing him with Josh Mulligan, who he's largely replaced in the starting lineup since Mulligan's injury, he's a different type of player, obviously, but I'm not quite sure he brings that sort of control that Mulligan has had in some games. And I think that's maybe one area where he maybe needs to work on it a little bit. But there is a player in there, absolutely, and there's been some games where he's been very impressive, other games not so much. And I think it's just kind of lowering the games where he's maybe a bit of a passenger and increasing the number of ones where he's more of an influential figure on not just the final result, but on the game itself.
Yeah, because it's round about, I think it was the Dunfermline game where Mulligan comes off, Chaiwa goes in, and then he gets that sort of that little extended time in the lineup. A really good patch, I think, sort of towards the end of January through February. I mean, obviously, plays well in that 2-1 win at Celtic Park. But you see a lot of flashes of exactly why Hibs would be interested in a player like that, and it is obvious to see why some of these clubs would be interested in bringing him in. Yeah. Obviously, there's been some interest from Celtic before, I think, as well. That seems to be heating up if the reports are to be believed. But in terms of somebody, I'm like raw talents, maybe a cliche, but you can see a lot of the elements of what would make a really good midfielder. I think, just like you say, Mulligan does sort of exert that control, does maybe have, I don't know, is it fair to say, what am I trying to say? But you think he's the sort of the more established option in the Premiership, and it'll be interesting to see how Chaiwa comes in next season, if indeed he is still at Easter Road with what he's learned so far.
Exactly, and I think one of the issues with Chaiwa, and David Gray's spoken about this, is that I think long-term they view him as a defensive midfielder, number 6. At the moment, I'm not sure he's got the discipline, and I don't think the club thinks he's got the discipline to be able to play that role effectively. And so what you've got is this sort of hybrid. Is he a 6? Is he an 8? Is he just sort of doing Miguel Chaiwa things?
Because I would have sort of put him more as an 8 at the minute.
Yeah, I think you're trying to get that combination in midfield. And I think when you've got 3 midfielders centrally like Hibs do, and you've got Jamie McGrath at the number 10, you then got Dan Barlasser, who's essentially sitting as a ball-playing 6, and then you need someone else in there who has got the legs, who's got the energy, who's got the stamina, who can track runners, who can do whatever. And I think that it's been interesting recently seeing him kind of tucking into that right-back slot when Felix Paslak is getting forward, because he's played there for Zambia sort of once or twice, Chaiwa. I think he was actually tried out there in one game, I forget which, but it might have been Dunfermline, and it was not a good experiment. Really didn't kind of cover himself in glory, I think, and it's understandable. He's playing a position that's maybe a little bit alien. Yeah. But I think that you can see signs that he is developing, he is progressing, and I think for David Gray, it's about, is he able to trust players? Is he able to trust players to do what he wants them to do? And I think, without naming names, I think it's fairly obvious the players who he trusts sort of implicitly, and the ones who, maybe there's still 1 or 2 question marks. And I think Chaiwa's gone from someone who maybe had a couple of question marks to who now has fewer question marks. I think he is someone who can be trusted to go and do a certain job. Maybe he doesn't always sort of do it to the best of his ability. He's still a young player. He is going to blow hot and cold. And I think it's easy to forget that sometimes. You look at somebody who's come in, who's had Champions League experience, made as many appearances for his national team as he has, and you're thinking he is still only, quite young. He's adapting to a new league. And I think it sort of feeds into that model of what Hibs want to be doing in terms of recruitment. They want to be finding these sort of, rough gems elsewhere, bringing them in, polishing them up, and then selling them on 18 months to 2 years later for much more than what they paid for. And I think, as I said, we've seen that with Bowie, we've seen that with Josh Doig, we might see it with other players. Mulligan's been linked with, with bigger clubs. Chaiwa currently being linked with bigger clubs. And I think it's a good selling point for Hibs to be able to say to players they want to sign, look, you sign for Hibs, then there's a very good chance.
This is the pathway.
Exactly. There's a very good chance you get international recognition. There's a very good chance you could end up going to a team in one of the sort of big 5 leagues, or in the case of Lewis Miller, and I know he's got a long-term injury, but somebody who then went to the Championship. So he's a level below a big 5 league, level below the English Premier League. And I think that Hibs have been quite bad at that recently. I think sort of sourcing players who can come in and then move on for a profit. There was a time when players were being signed that there wasn't really, they were kind of at their peak. They were at that ceiling. There wasn't really anywhere else for them to go. They were coming in, and then it was a struggle for Hibs to sort of move them on. Now I think we're seeing more that there is a focus on bringing in players who can certainly do a job while they're at the club, but use it as a stepping stone, not in a disrespectful way. Obviously, you don't want somebody coming in and sort of day 2, they're talking about moving on to bigger and better things. But if you've got somebody coming in and they're sort of putting in 100% every week because they want to improve, because they want to get noticed, they want to kind of put themselves long-term in the shop window, that's a great thing for Hibs to have.
It's a platform. But that works as much for Hibs as for another club. You get these players coming in, like you say, if you put 100% in, then the benefits to that are going to be tangible for Hibs, both in a sort of financial sense down the road, but you look at some of the players who you'd maybe have in that category at the minute, like Owen Elding's, or long term is going to go on to I don't want to say higher levels. That feels unfair, but you know what I mean. He's going to put himself in the. I think
he probably will
for those top teams.
Yeah.
Not that Hibs isn't a top team, but having him in the door at the minute, you see maybe Aberdeen's not the best case. Unfair on him trying to do that job 10v11, but the last few performances has played to a really high level, and Hibs are feeling the benefit of that.
Elding's a great example of someone who there was interest from clubs further up the food chain than Hibs. Clubs who...
So European interest, wasn't it?
There was. And that's, clubs who are maybe looking at Elding and thinking, well, this would be a great player to put in our academy or our B team, with a view to him coming into the starting lineup in 12 to 18 months' time. And Elding's camp was very kind of firm on this and saying he's going somewhere where he's going to play football. So if you're Hibs and you're saying, we can't offer you, X amount, or we can't offer you what, this club's offering you, but we can guarantee you first team football in a good league that's watched by international teams, that's watched by bigger clubs, and you get the chance to develop, you get the chance to progress. You make a name for yourself, you put yourself in the shop window, you prove that you can do it at a level higher than what you were previously doing it, and then you move on to the next level. It's what Kieran Bowie did. And if you look at if you're a club and you're looking to sell a player, then that's also gonna have an impact. You say, well, we know that if he goes to Hibs, then he will get game time. So the player can trust us that this is a good move for them. But then in terms of sell on or add-ons or whatever, then the selling club's probably going to benefit too. So it's something that suits every party. And I think Hibs are getting very good at making more of that sort of pathway and saying, this is what we can offer you. We're not sort of big five club. We don't have the same financial sort of riches as some teams, but what we can give you is something better, where you can come in, play some games for us, and then you can move on to another level. And then that obviously boosts Hibs in a financial sense. They look to bring in the next person to do that, and the conveyor belt continues. And nobody probably wants to think of Hibs as a selling club, but it's a reality. It's where they are. But it doesn't have to be about players going for a pittance. It's not about players coming in and then leaving 6 months later. And it's kind of, what was that? Oh, that was your player who was in on a 4-year deal who's already moved on for 1.5 million. It's about bringing players in, giving them long-term contracts, helping them to progress, and then making a big profit on what you paid for them. Yeah, giving them something as much. So you talk about the regular minutes, but I know it's something David Gray speaks about a lot. Like the international eyes are on. I mean, you think the number of players who've gone to play for Australia. You've got sort of the likes of Rocky and Miguel Chaiwa as well. Obviously, Eldin will be in that conversation. I know that Ireland are interested to sort of expedite that paperwork and get that done as soon as possible. Even someone like Nectar Triantis, who was called up by Australia, didn't play for them, but then went on to, but was then changed his eligibility for Greece. Exactly, and it's that sort of, it is that window, and it's that window of opportunity of saying you can get noticed by other clubs, but you can also get noticed by national teams. And it's. Yeah, there are a lot of boxes ticked there. And if you're a player who's looking to further your career, then at the moment, Hibs looks like a really good destination, or a really good kind of sort of stopping off point. Yeah. Well, let's move on and talk a little bit about we won't go too far into the split. Obviously, still a wee bit of time away, but looking back on what's happened so far in the pre-split, I think you can look at it in a number of ways. I mean, a theme we've spoken about a lot is this theme of missed opportunities, missed chances. Or will Hibs look back? How will they look back on the season? And I think in many ways you can look at the opportunities that could have been. I think it depends where they finish. It depends on when they finish, and we have to be hesitant to sort of make any conclusions yet. It's still 5 games to go, but just on paper, in terms of what's happened so far, you also have to. I'm reticent to say it because I'm not entirely sure, but it's at least a very similar points tally to what they had going into the split, if not the same as where they were last season. And I think you and I just spoke about this off camera. It's that shift away from we're trying to chase these teams. Well, the shift to we're trying to chase these teams on top rather than we're trying to keep these teams below us. I guess there's still an element of that, especially when you look at the Falkirk Rangers game. There was a sort of time when you're thinking Falkirk could move 2 points up, and I think they showed their threats
in abundance up until that remarkable Rangers comeback, getting those 6 goals. So there's an element of both that you are chasing, but you are also defending.
Yeah, but I think the biggest difference for me is that I think it's very easy to look at what other teams are doing this season and say Hibs have regressed. I'm not 100% sure that's necessarily the case. I think perhaps Hibs have remained consistent, and it's just that other teams have got better. Other teams have done broadly what Hibs did last season. And it's difficult because, I mean, we've done this to death. We've spoken about missed opportunities. We've spoken about the kind of general feeling of, I don't know, kind of middle of the road, sort of plodding along to the end of the season. Even if Hibs do finish 4th, then does it feel like a disappointment? And in some ways, you think that's a measure of how far the club's come, because it wasn't so long ago that Nick Montgomery was talking about the euphoria of finishing in the top 6, which, I mean, frankly, for a club like Hibs is a mad sort of point of view.
It should be the baseline.
Exactly. And, you know, we can look at like how relatively little Hibs have backed up a 3rd place finish with another kind of 3rd, 4th, 5th place finish the following season. It hasn't happened all that often, which is, you know, not great for a club of Hibs stature, not great for a club that has the ambitions that Hibs have. But I think it is about missed opportunities. That it's, you know, there have been games in which Hibs last season would have got a result. This season they haven't. I'm not sure there's been a statement win of note. I know there was the victory over Hearts in December. I know they beat Celtic at Celtic Park. But because of Celtic struggles, that maybe doesn't feel as impressive as it might have once. Not to take anything away from it. It was a good performance. It was a good result. It ended a run of 16 years without a win at Parkhead. But at the same time, if that's the kind of key victory in a season that has just sort of plodded along, then it's a little bit disappointing when you consider last season, you know, Hibs beat Hearts quite convincingly home and away. They beat Celtic at Easter Road. They beat Rangers at Ibrox.
There were a lot of highlights.
There were statement wins, and this season there haven't really been the same number of statement wins. And I think the high of last season, it raises expectation levels. It kind of raises excitement. It raises, I suppose, the kind of feeling that, you know, Hibs should be doing what other teams above them are doing. And because they're not, then it's not just, oh, well, that's a bit disappointing. It becomes, this has been a disastrous season. I've seen people calling it a disastrous season.
Maybe a bit far.
I've been around for a certain number of years, and I've seen my fair share of disastrous Hibs seasons, and I'm not sure this one comes close. In the context of how good last season was, then yeah, it's disappointing. But I suppose the big question for me is, Hibs still do have this opportunity to finish 4th. And I think following up a 3rd place finish with a 4th place finish is not terrible. I think it's good.
It's consistency.
Exactly. It's consistency. I think it represents something resembling continued progress, even if it will be a little bit of a kind of last minute scramble to get in there. But, you know, I think it's just everything else with Celtic and Rangers both having elements to the season where they've been underperforming, Hearts overperforming, Motherwell having the season that they've had. I think it just, in context, it looks like it's been a bit of an underwhelming season. And I think it probably has in some ways. There have been too many results where it's been just, it's been, you know, missed opportunities. It's been draws that could have been victories. It's been defeats that could have been draws. And I think, you know, even the style of play sometimes is, you know, getting some fans down. When you look at I've talked before about the Legia Warsaw game in Poland, where, you know, for that sort of 20-minute period in the second half, Hibs were unplayable. And I feel like there's maybe the longest hangover in sporting history, that Hibs haven't ever really recovered from that. I'm not sure they've really kind of got over how that game ended, the fact that they were so close to getting that league phase football in Europe. And it's just kind of been dwindling from then on. And they could have a very good post-split schedule. They could potentially win every game. I don't think that'll happen, but
clip that.
Potentially it could. And then, you know, you've got a good end to the season, and maybe that does change the narrative a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think it's a combination of a lot of factors. That last season was so good from an unexpected start. And then this season, it's almost been a case of, well, pick up where you left off. You've got the European games, and then it's just never quite hit the heights that it did last season. There's not been the unbeaten runs to the same extent. There's not been the statement wins. There's not been anything like that to kind of capture the attention. And as a result, it's felt sort of quite plodding at times. It's felt like a bit of a chore. And I think there's an awful lot of people who just want the season to be over. And I think, the onus now is on Hibs to prove that they can do it in big games, that they can get statement wins, that they can sort of finish the season on a high and potentially get back into Europe. And that would feel, if not like progress, it would feel like consistency. Whereas if they fail to finish in the European places, if they don't get into Europe, then it will be, I think the season will be viewed as a disappointment.
I think the context is really important as well. You look back on a season when Hibs come third, they have that 17-game unbeaten run. There's, a better sense of progression in the cups and something to build towards in the next season. Then going into the 150th anniversary, that's always going to build a sense of expectation that there's going to be some sort of big fairy tale ending at the end in some capacity. I mean, I certainly felt, I don't know if you were the same, if fans were the same.
It's not the Hibs way, is it?
But, and then I think exactly like you say, you go into that Legia Warsaw game, and I mean, by sort of 40 minutes, I'm sitting there at least thinking, my word, like, what it's a what could have been. Obviously Mulligan gets Hibs back in the first leg, and then the second leg, it's just a little sense of deflation. I think then going from that sort of plateau right up to the top, and I mean, you talk about not having a statement win. I would consider the Edinburgh derby to be one of those, and I would consider it to be quite similar to that Legia game in some ways. But I think when Chaiwa gets that third goal, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's then at least an opportunity for a fourth goal for Hibs.
Yeah, Martin Boyle from about 40 yards out off the crossbar.
That's the one. Oh yeah, of course. I remember.
Not that it's haunted me ever since.
I was up on my feet in the Easter Road bar at that point. But it's similar to, I think about the Edinburgh derby, and by the time Kieran Bowie scores the third, you do just think, like, how many is it going to be? And
but the thing is, it could have been more. And it feels like Hearts got back into the game late on, and if not for that kind of reflex save by Raphael Salinger towards the end, it could have been a 3-3 draw, and Hibs would have thrown away a 3-0 lead. And that's why
you think about the Beningame shot as well. I mean, that could have been 3-3, 3-4.
Exactly, and that's why I think it doesn't feel like a statement win. It feels like so many Hibs wins this season. It felt a bit scrambled. It felt a bit sort of untidy. And if Hibs had gone 4-0 up, then that's a different story. And again, they were very close to doing it. And it just feels a little bit like, I don't know, I feel like too often this season Hibs have kind of threatened to do something like that. They threatened to do it in the Legia game. They threatened to do it against Hearts. They maybe threatened to do it against Kilmarnock in that first game of the season. Yeah. They threatened to do it against Kilmarnock more recently, and it just hasn't quite happened. So that's my sort of argument about any derby win is a good win. I mean, let's not pretend it isn't. But I think the nature of that win and how it nearly played out, and a sliding doors moment, that kind of thing, it doesn't feel like a statement win because it was so very nearly a disaster. And it really should have been a kind of a platform for Hibs to think, right, we're not going to let this happen again. We need to put games to bed when we've got the opportunity to do so. We need to, this needs to be a turning point. It just wasn't. And we've seen Hibs conceding late goals that have turned out to be, they've had a big say in the final outcome of games since then, which suggests that the lessons weren't properly learned. So I appreciate what you're saying. Like, yes, close to a statement win, particularly when Hearts are still leading the league. It's the kind of season they're having. Yes, but also just it should have been more convincing. They should have been out of sight. They very nearly chucked it away, and that's why it doesn't feel as statement winny as it should. For me.
I think it at least shows, from my perspective, and maybe you'll disagree, but it shows an area of improvement from last season, because I look back on the last season. Obviously, this sort of incredible time to be a Hibs supporter, to be at Hibs and watch that unbeaten streak. But I don't remember all that many times where you had those spells where Hibs looked unplayable, where Hibs looked like they were going to go and score 3, 4, 5, 6 goals. I think what we've seen in glances so far this season is that there is that capacity. And I take your point that then you have these games where a late goal gets conceded or a late goal nearly gets conceded, and it does then feel underwhelming. But I think having that capacity at least is exciting, and knowing it ties into the recruitment as well, that you have these really good players coming into the club, some of whom, I mean, the majority of whom will stay on until next season. It feels like the sort of Route 1 fundamentals are, I don't want to say easy to fix, because then why have they not been fixed so far? But it feels like there's a platform to do something quite exciting.
Yeah, but it's all well and good saying that there's times that Hibs have looked like they could go on and score 4, 5, 6, but they haven't. But the other sort of fundamental difference is last season, Hibs were grinding out results in games, and this season they haven't really managed to do it as much.
Well, they're shoring up at the back in the last 5 minutes last season.
Yeah, I mean, there were times when, Hibs were managing to get 1-0 wins, and this season they've been draws, or they were getting a 2-1 win, they were holding on, something like that. I mean, we know that late goals were an issue last season, but then they did manage to, I suppose, kind of stem the flow a little bit towards the second half of the campaign. And this season, we've maybe not seen that as much. So I think it's all well and good to have games where you look unplayable, you look like you could run up a cricket score. But at the same time, for that to be progress, you also then have to maintain the good bits from the previous season, which was winning ugly and, grinding out results. And there just hasn't been enough of that this season. And that's partly why it feels underwhelming. That's partly why it feels like it's been a missed opportunity. And yeah, there's still 5 games to go. Maybe everything could change. I'm prepared to be proven wrong.
It's almost like that gif from the Star Wars film when you got the wee droid, and it sort of like plugs one of the holes, and then another 2 start like firing off sparks. It is. I mean, improvement does rely on taking the good things you've done in one season and then building on that. And it does feel in some ways that there are different things to be positive about, but there are also things that if had have been transferred over. I mean, you mentioned the Celtic and Rangers having a really poor start to the season. I think you look at other teams who were able to capitalize on that, and you think, well, why couldn't Hibs? So there will always be that underwhelming element. I just think I get called negative a lot, which I disagree with, especially when in 5 minutes I'm talking about all of these. I'm quite a positive person, and I do see elements for positivity. I think they're important to recognize.
Yeah,
you're just negative.
Pragmatic, I think, is what I'm going for. I think that there have been positives, but they've been overshadowed by other sort of issues not being dealt with, overhanging issues from last season,
which are equally important to talk about.
And I think and when you're football it's a fickle game. You can have the highs and the lows, and there are extremes. It's like when people say, like such and such is the worst Hibs player I've ever seen. I think, how old are you? Where have you been? What have you been watching? Because, inevitably that, you can think in your head there's 15 to 20 other candidates who could come before the person they're mentioning. And it's, like I say, people referring to this season as a disaster or something like that. And it's not. But that's what sport does to you. It's what football does to you. It's why we kind of love it and probably hate it in equal measures. That you can go from having these sort of feelings of euphoria to then having this sort of feeling of like utter like desolation. Probably about 3 or 4 months apart.
Yeah.
Especially so when you're a Hibs fan, when you're following Hibs. Hibs do like to put the fans through the mill a bit more than what it seems like. They like putting the fans through the mill a bit more than other clubs. And I think that it almost feels like if Hibs have like a really strong finish to the season, if they win all their post-split games, if they finish 4th, they get back into Europe, there's still going to be almost like a reaction from the fans. It was like, yeah, well, still wasn't that great.
I think that largely depends on the context of what happens elsewhere, because there are always going to be other scenarios. Not going to mention them because this is not the space for that, and but there will always be other scenarios that will influence the way this season looks. And exactly like I said, why shouldn't that be Hibs? Why shouldn't that be the aspiration? And I think so. Sometimes, I said in the Aberdeen piece, they've looked too comfortable. They've looked to want to be too comfortable, and it's not always a case of that. And that was, sort of getting the fundamentals right, but also having a bit of that fire. You were talking about this earlier, having that little bit of snarl,
the nasty streak.
The nasty streak. Yeah. That's the one. Is something that's maybe been lacking. So if you're watching this, Hibs, there we go. Sort of mid to 75% season review. Yeah, get your nasty streak. Get your nasty streak. That's all that's required. We'll leave it there. Obviously, slightly quiet week with a little break before we kick off the split on Sunday. Next Sunday, with the Edinburgh Derby. There'll be lots of content coming out throughout the week before that. And Patrick and I will see you at Easter Road for that game in about just over a week's time. So see you then, and thank you very much for all of your support on social media, all of your support here on YouTube. We will see you very soon. Bye for now.